ESPN says the Vikings have the worst roster in the NFC North. That's what we're talking about today, Tuesday, July 7th on Bleav in Vikings, presented by FanDuel. And I'm your host, Mike Wobschall. Just you and me today as we take a look at the NFC North and a piece done by ESPN analysts as they assessed every roster in the league and ranked them 1 to 32. So we're going to take a closer look at what they thought about the Vikings and the NFC North. Before we get into that, though, please do us a favor, subscribe to Bleav in Vikings, and don't forget to leave a 5-star rating and write a review. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Just go there, find us, subscribe to Bleav in Vikings, and don't forget to leave that 5-star rating and write a review. It helps us out. And pardon me, for those of you watching on YouTube, a different background, a different environment for me. Went through a move recently, so we don't have the fancy setup with the Vikings gear and garb in the background quite yet. We'll have to make do with what we have for now. But for those of you listening, it's no difference. The show goes on. So a couple of things to get to today. I want to react to that piece that I teased by ESPN, where they rank every roster in the NFL 1 to 32. But before doing so, let's take a look at FanDuel and see what the betting market is saying could be in store for the Vikings and the rest of the NFC North in 2026, because there are some threads that we're going to weave into our analysis of ESPN's analysis of the rosters that has to do with some of the betting markets. So when you take a look at FanDuel right now and the odds that the market has for teams to win the NFC and teams to win the Super Bowl, and then we hyper focus it on our neighborhood here for Vikings fans and the NFC North. The general consensus is the Lions are favored in the division to win the division, and of the division teams, they have the best odds to win the NFC and the Super Bowl. The second choice is the Green Bay Packers. The third choice is the Chicago Bears. The fourth choice is the Minnesota Vikings, and that plays itself out in ESPN's piece where they rank the rosters 1 to 32. Specifically, though, what are the odds? Well, Detroit is 8 to 1 to win the NFC over at FanDuel, 17 to 1 to win the Super Bowl. Second is Green Bay. Detroit was 8 to 1 to win the NFC. Green Bay is 11 to 1 to win the NFC, and 25 to 1 to win the Super Bowl. The Bears 14 to 1 to win the NFC. And 27 to 1 to win the Super Bowl. The Vikings 25 to 1 to win the NFC and 45 to 1 to win the Super Bowl. Now, when you, as I mentioned, hyper focus it on the NFC North, what does the market say about the division? Well, they have the Detroit Lions favored to win the division at plus 145. So not even 1.5 times your money to take the Lions. So a pretty heavy favorite. The second choice is Green Bay at plus 270. Third choice, Chicago at plus 310. And then all the way down, fourth choice is the Vikings at 5 to 1. So as you can sort of pick up here, I won't call it hate, but I'll call it doubt, I think, from the public and from analysts about the Vikings in 2026. And that to me is, I don't want to say surprising, but I think it's worth taking a pretty hard look at, because the Vikings did what they did last season, won the last 5 games of the season to try and make a last-second playoff push, and did all of that with bottom-of-the-barrel quarterback play. Not to be disrespectful to who was out on the field for them, but let's just be honest about it. The quarterback play was bottom of the barrel. And the Vikings were still able to, put a solid season together, a solid enough season together where they didn't embarrass themselves thanks to that 5-game winning streak at the end of the season. And now they have the same quarterback, J.J. McCarthy, coming back, but they've added Kyler Murray. Now, say what you want about Kyler Murray. You might not like him or you might like him a lot, but either way, it's an X factor. It's a question mark. It's a potential for a higher ceiling, a better performance at the position than the Vikings got last year. And so you add in the fact that they have really good skill position players. They have an offensive line that's intact from last year and includes 2 very good offensive tackles. I mean, I don't know that the Vikings should be that far off the path from, say, the Green Bay Packers or the Chicago Bears. And they are, if you take a look at the betting market. So it's interesting to me. We mentioned this earlier in the offseason. There's value there. If you're high on the Vikings, you might always be high on the Vikings because you're a Vikings fan. But if you can separate yourself a little bit and step back from it and try to objectively analyze it, and you think the Vikings have better than a snowball's chance to compete in the NFC North this year or in the NFC this year, there's some value there in the betting markets. There's some value at 5-1 to win the NFC North right now. There's some value at 45-1 to win the Super Bowl and 25-1 to win the NFC. Now, those are high achievements. It's not very often that a team does those things, but still, 25-1 is 25-1, and that's what the Vikings are to win the NFC. But I'd focus more on the division, something that's a little bit more achievable and realistic. And at 5-1, the Minnesota Vikings sitting there at 5-1, I think is something to at least take a look at if you're high on Kyler Murray and you like what the Vikings have in terms of a roster. Now, here are some people who don't like what the Vikings have in terms of their roster, and that is these ESPN analysts. And I'm not disrespecting them. I think that it's a hard job to take a look at every single roster and analyze it and rank it 1 to 32. But ESPN NFL analysts Mike Clay, Aaron Schatz, and Seth Walder were tasked with doing just that. Mike Clay projected every starting lineup, and then he identified each team's position of strength and weakness. So we're going to talk about that with regard to the Vikings and the rest of the NFC North. Seth Walder picked an X factor for each roster, and then Aaron Schatz chose non-starters who could end up being key players for their teams this season. Again, this is at ESPN.com right now, and kudos to Mike Clay, Aaron Schatz, Seth Walder, the editors, and the photo journalists for all of their work on this piece. It's very well done. So looking in at not just the Vikings, but the rest of the NFC North, it falls in line with the betting market. These ESPN NFL analysts ranked Detroit as the best roster in the NFC North and 6th in the NFL. Green Bay 10th in the NFL and 2nd in the NFC North. Chicago 17th in the NFL for a roster, 3rd in the NFC North, and the Vikings 22nd. The 22nd best roster in the NFL, according to ESPN.com, goes to the Minnesota Vikings, the worst roster in the NFC North, according to this piece. Now, for the Minnesota Vikings, the analysts identified the strength of the roster as the pass catchers, and I think we could probably all agree with that. Specifically going to the write-up at ESPN.com for the Vikings, this is what they said about the pass catchers. The biggest strength: receivers Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, and newcomer Jawan Jennings, along with tight end TJ Hawkinson, form a terrific group of targets for whoever wins the quarterback job. Even in a down season, Jefferson delivered his 6th consecutive season with 1,000+ receiving yards last year, remains arguably the best wide receiver in the NFL. Addison, Jennings, they go on to write about. And then they even give Hawkinson some credit, saying he's been down the past 2 seasons, but still at 29 years old remains one of the league's best two-way tight ends. That's according to Mike Clay. Biggest weakness, according to Clay, on the Vikings roster is running back. He says it was a bit surprising that the Vikings did little to address this position after their running backs finished 30th in both rushing yards and scrimmage yards last season. So calling out Aaron Jones a little bit here and Jordan Mason, and then mentioning that they didn't do anything to add to the Jones-Mason tandem, just using a 6th-round pick on undersized, they say, running back Damon Claiborne. So these analysts not high on the Vikings running backs, but very high on the Vikings pass catchers. As for an X factor, Seth Walder identified the interior of the offensive line, and this is where I sort of diverge from this piece here at ESPN on the Vikings roster. I don't disagree that it's an important part of the equation for the Vikings, but I don't think it's an unknown factor. To me, Will Fries at right guard, Donovan Jackson at left guard, a 1st rounder 2 years ago, and then Blake Brandel at center. I think these guys are going to be solid. I think it's going to be their 2nd year playing together. I expect them to improve. I don't think this is an unknown part of the equation for the Vikings, I think this is going to be just fine. And it's buoyed by the fact that they have two really good offensive tackles. So I think finally the Vikings offensive line may be in a good spot. And that's where, again, I diverge a little bit from this piece. And I think the Vikings roster is better than the 22nd best roster in the NFL. And certainly I don't think it's the worst roster in the NFC North. Non-starter to know, according to Aaron Schatz, I thought was interesting. Defensive lineman / edge rusher Tyron Ingram Dawkins. This is what Schatz says about Ingram Dawkins. A 5th-round pick out of Georgia in 2025, Ingram Dawkins is the only drafted player on the edge depth chart behind starters Andrew Van Ginkel and Dallas Turner. He's moving over after playing inside as a 5-tech last season in 2025. Ingram Dawkins had a higher pass rush win rate inside than on his edge snaps. None of Minnesota's edge rushers played more than 2/3 of the snaps last season. So Ingram Dawkins is going to get even more chances to make plays in 2026. So interesting right up there by Aaron Schatz. I think that's good, keen insight on a potentially key role player for the Vikings in 2025. So that's their assessment of the Vikings roster. No one interesting, I don't think, that they projected in their starting lineup. They had Caleb Banks as a starter at defensive tackle and Levi Drake Rodriguez as the other starter inside at defensive tackle, Van Ginkel and Turner as the edge, Cashman and Wilson at linebacker. No surprises there. The 3 corners, Murphy Jr., Rogers, and James Pierre. And then at safety, they had Josh Metellus and Theo Jackson. Interesting, no Harrison Smith in their projection, but I do think Harry's going to be back. I think this is better than the 22nd roster in the NFL. That is for sure. Breaking down what they said about the rest of the NFC North, we'll start with the Detroit Lions, who they ranked 6th. ESPN ranked the Lions roster 6th in the NFL. They identified the strength as their offensive playmakers, the skill position guys, Jahmyr Gibbs at running back, of course, Amon-Ra St. Brown at wide receiver, and Sam Laporta at tight end. They said the weakness is the secondary. Of course, Terrion Arnold being released recently doesn't help that, but even before that, they might have identified that as a weakness for the Lions roster. And then their X factor is right tackle, which I think is an interesting call out because stalwart right tackle Penei Sewell was moved over to left tackle. And so they have a 1st-round pick now at right tackle. So a little bit of change going on for the Lions offensive line. The 2nd best roster in the NFC North, according to ESPN's NFL analysts, was the Green Bay Packers. They were 10th overall in the NFL, 2nd in the NFC North. The strength was safeties, which you can understand why with McKinney, one of the best safeties in the NFL there. Weakness was the defensive line, where they have a couple of guys coming back from injuries. X factor, and I thought this was interesting too, X factor, according to these ESPN analysts for the Green Bay Packers, was their run-pass ratio, which to me is calling out Matt LaFleur, which to me makes me wonder, we got a closet Packers fan here among these 3 who thinks the roster is really good and the team should be better, but they're not happy with the head coach. I don't know, just a hunch. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that was unfair, but calling out Matt LaFleur and play calling as the X factor for the Green Bay Packers roster. And then finally, 3rd in the NFC North, 17th in the NFL for roster strength, according to these ESPN analysts, is the Chicago Bears. They identify strength as the offensive line, where there is some change there. They had Drew Dahlman retire. They signed Garrett Bradbury to be their starting center. Weakness is the defensive line, and they cited some age and some guys coming back from injury. And then X factor, Caleb Williams, which I thought was interesting. I don't think he's an X factor. I thought he really came of age last season. I think he proved himself, but I think these ESPN analysts want to see him prove himself again. So they have Caleb Williams identified as the X factor, which I guess is fair because he wasn't as good 2 years ago as he was last year. So this is sort of the rubber match, if you will, season for Caleb Williams that will sort of dictate which way maybe the early part of his career goes. But I am high on Caleb Williams. I think he's a playmaker. I like the way he can improvise. I think he's got a good attitude. But ESPN has identified Caleb Williams as the X factor. So not going to say it's a bunch of hate on the Vikings roster, but definitely some questioning of the Vikings roster by the ESPN NFL analysts who did that piece. Nice job by those guys, though, in all seriousness. Not being critical of it. Just thought it was an interesting piece of NFL fodder for us to think about and talk about as we try and get through the only abyss on the calendar during the year for NFL fans is right now, the 2.5 or 3 weeks before training camp begins at the end of July. So that's going to do it for this episode of Bleav in Vikings. As always, we thank you for listening and for watching. And don't forget to hit subscribe, leave a 5-star rating, and write a review. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This episode of Bleav in Vikings presented by FanDuel is over. We'll be back later in the offseason, though, of course, next week with some more content. See if I can get my co-host Bryant McKinney back here and get some of his thoughts on the end of the Vikings offseason and what might be in store for the Vikings in 2026. Also, congrats to Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift. That's been some big news in the NFL world with their wedding at Madison Square Garden. I'm sure there were some Vikings dignitaries in attendance. That'd be my guess, although I haven't seen any photos. But when we get McKinney back on here, we'll ask him about that. I don't think he got the invite, not that I know of anyway. So we'll ask him why the heck not. He's plugged into the music industry and the NFL world. And then we'll ask him for some more thoughts on the Vikings, the wedding between Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift, and much more. So again, on behalf of everyone here at Bleav in Vikings, this is Wobby signing off for now. Remember, everyone, until next time, keep believing.